And I'm going to keep my opening remarks very, very brief, which is just to say that this is a tradition for our programs going back. It's got to be at least 5 years, maybe more than that. And, you know, it's been so valuable. So once again, we're really, really looking forward to the program today. I'm going to let you guys do your own handoff. 7 years, Michelle, so that's wonderful. And it looks like we're starting with the Smart WIT group. And so I'm going to turn it over to Ciprian and let him navigate this part of the program.
Oh, I didn't know that it's going to be, I have nothing to say. I just have two fantastic students who will give two great talks, Marta and Lacey. You know, they're not just my students. They work with many of the other faculty, including Jennifer and Jacek and Karen and Michelle. So I really enjoy and Vadim. Sorry, thank you all for sharing your ideas and helping with this fantastic event. So with no further ado, I think that's Lacey's first, or?
So I think Marta will actually be going first.
Okay.
Absolutely. Let me try to go ahead and share my screen. Can somebody confirm to me that you can see a browser with the first slide? Got it. Perfect. So let me go ahead and present. So my name is Marta Karas. I am a PhD candidate in the Department of Biostatistics, and it is my great pleasure to present to you today about the work that we have done with colleagues from the WIT and Engage group. And I hope that this work will be of interest to researchers who use physical activity measurements in their work and want to learn how some of these measures, some of the most common accelerometry-derived physical activity measures, compare with each other. And without further ado, this slide presents the overview of this short presentation, and I will start by introducing wearable accelerometry data and examples of physical, let me just see, because I see there is a, okay. I was just checking out the chat. So I'll start by introducing the wearable accelerometry data and most commonly used physical activity summary measures. I will very briefly comment about the methods we have used in this project and spend most of the time of my presentation presenting some of the early results we obtained, which is showing what are the correlations between most commonly used physical activity summary measures across different demographics, for example, age, and the mapping we derive between the pairs of physical activity measures, and as well as an example of replication on one of the existing work done with Baltimore Longitudinal Study of Aging, which is going to show us how the derived mapping can be utilized to provide comparability across the studies that have been using one measure to the studies which are using the existing alternatives. Wearable accelerometry data allows us for objectively measured monitoring of physical activity of individuals. And here on the left-hand side, we are having an example of a wearable accelerometry device. Such activity monitors typically consist of accelerometer, which is a small electromechanical device that is collecting acceleration of a body along 3 orthogonal axes. The acceleration is collected at a frequency that yields typically up to 100 observations per second per each of the axes. And here on the top right-hand side, we are having an example of such a data collected over 7 subsequent minutes. And epidemiological studies commonly employ an aggregate of such high-frequency accelerometry data at various temporal resolutions. So, for example, we may want to get one value per 1 minute aggregate, and such aggregate being, for example, so-called activity counts and number of steps and others. And in fact, minute level physical activity summary measures tend to be most common in a public health research. Examples of using such data include quantifying daily activity trajectories, providing summary of time spent in different physical activity intensity levels, and describing patterns of sedentary and active time accumulation. To make one of the examples more concrete, this plot is showing 4 trajectories estimated across 4 groups of age. The trajectories of physical activity estimated with the use of activity counts measure across the day. This is a picture coming from the paper Schrack et al. What you can see is that it is an example of the data used to quantify the differences across age groups when it comes to physical activity. And this slide lists examples of some of the most commonly used accelerometry-derived physical activity minute level measures. So what we have is actigraph activity counts, which remain one of the most widely used measures. However, this measure is proprietary, and a licensed software named ActiLife is needed to compute and download this actigraph activity counts data. Recently, a number of open source alternatives, open source summary measures have been proposed, and these include MEMS, Animal, MET, and AI. So the presence of open source summary measures makes it possible to collect, aggregate, and analyze raw accelerometry data in a way that each step of the analysis is unmasked, is known to the researcher. However, the correlation between widely used activity counts and open source measures and whether it is whether it differs across demographics such age, sex, and BMI has not been determined. And on the top of that, we don't really have a mapping between activity counts and those measures, so as we could either compare some of the previous studies or reuse already existing thresholds of activity counts when we start working with this open source summary measure alternatives. So this is precisely the problem that our work tried to address. We want to compute and compare these 5 metrics and see what are how well they compare. And let me just highlight that our research, this problem is particularly timely given the most recent release of enhanced data that gives us physical activity data in the forms of MEMS unit, whereas it does not give us activity counts that were in turn used in the previous releases of enhanced and in the works that were using this data. Very briefly about the methods, we use the data coming from Baltimore Longitudinal Study of Aging, subcohort of 655 individuals that were wearing the device for 6 days. We computed and compared first minute level activity counts that we derive with ActiLife proprietary software and minute level measures that we computed with the open source software. And I would like to make sure to highlight the contribution of John Mushelli, who developed, tested, documented, and published the summarized actigraphy package, which is a software that allows to compute all these 4 measures in a unified way. And you can access his work under this GitHub repository. And now I'm going to spend the rest of the time presenting about the results. So this slide is presenting the results of computing correlation between activity counts and MEMS, activity counts and animal and MET and AI across 650 individuals we have in our data. This table is summarizing the mean subject-specific correlation we have. Let me quickly check the chat. This slide is summarizing mean values of the correlations where each value that is aggregated here comes from one individual. You can see that the correlation between actigraph activity counts and MEMS is particularly high. On the top of that, these 4 plots are summarizing subject-specific correlations between 4 respective measures and activity counts, but it's also showing the estimated association between the correlation considered as an outcome and the age. And what you can see is that across the 3 measures we considered, there's not really a strong association of age on the correlation, which is making, for example, MEMS a particularly interesting potential surrogate for activity counts across the wide range of age population. moving forward, this slide is presenting a mapping between a minute level physical activity measures ACE activity counts and 4 respective open source alternatives we are considering. What you can see here is approximately 1% of all the data points we are having that are plotted here. And the black lines are the fits estimated with the GAM models that we obtain. You can think about them about like a smooth mean of the points as we are seeing them here. This mapping allowed us, among other things, to deliver corresponding thresholds, the thresholds of the values of the open source measures that are corresponding to already existing ones. For example, the value of 1853 has been widely used as a threshold of activity count separating active versus non-active minute with the data collected at left wrist. And we were able to obtain a corresponding threshold with means as well with the other metrics. And last but not least, this slide is showing an example of one of the previous works in which we were trying to replicate the age-related differences in physical activity daily patterns. It is the plot that I showed in one of the earlier slides. What you can see here are, first of all, 4 thick, transparent lines, which are showing the estimated medians of physical activity counts across the 4 age groups. And what you can see with the thin, solid lines is a similar estimate that was obtained with the use of a means metric, later translated, mapped into activity counts with the use of our mapping we got. So the message we can get from such a plot is that indeed we are able to use the open source metrics in a way that gives us very comparable results to the so far widely used proprietary information. And I'm going to skip comparison across the other metrics for the sake of time. I'm going to conclude with the summary that we computed and compared minute level summary measures using ActiGraph activity counts, a proprietary measure, as well as open source alternatives. We showed what are the correlations between these measures and how they differ across certain demographics. We provided a mapping between those measures to allow researchers to compare the results with the new metrics with the previous works that were using the widely used activity graph activity counts. And we replicated one of the previous results. Done with BLSA as well. And that's it, what I what I prepared for today. I thank you for your attention. I'm happy to take questions, if any, either now or later, depending on how we are doing time-wise.
Thank you, Marta. I believe we're going to turn to Lacey next, unless anyone has a really urgent burning question, but we'll have a little time for questions right after Lacey's presentation.
Oh, thank you.
All right, without further ado, I will go ahead and share my screen. And can you all see the full screen now? All right. So my name is Lacey Etzkorn. My advisor is Ciprian Crenitano, and I have been working for the past few years. My cat showed up at just the right moment. With the multi-center AIDS cohort study. The CDC estimates that nearly 1/3 of people in the US living with HIV are over the age of 55. So the population of people living with HIV in the US is aging, and it's really important to understand how people with HIV age, especially since people with HIV tend to accumulate a lot more chronic conditions and components of frailty with increasing age. So one of the things that I've been focusing on in my research is looking at how we use multimodal wearable devices to to understand the health of people with multiple comorbid conditions, specifically people living with HIV. I think that these multimodal wearable devices, or these wearable devices that monitor multiple biological signals or health or body systems at a time, are really important for studying people with multiple chronic conditions, because it allows us to sort of see the interplay between the affected body systems during people's daily lives. So the multimodal device that I've been working with in the multi-center AIDS cohort study is called the Zio Xt Patch. The Zio Xt Patch is a wearable electrocardiogram patch, or ECG patch, and it's primarily marketed towards clinicians who want to see if their patients experience some of these rare cardiac arrhythmias. The Zio Xt Patch can be worn in the shower, and it can be worn for up to 2 weeks at a time. So clinicians feel that they can get a good snapshot of whether or not a patient experiences a rare arrhythmia in a 2-week time interval. But what the large studies have learned is that they can get the ECG data and the accelerometer data from these devices and actually study what they will study changes in ECG features and activity through people's daily lives. So we have Zio Patch data for about 1,200 people in the multi-center AIDS cohort study. So this is what some of this data from the Zio Xt Patch looks like. In the top panel, we have some of that accelerometer data that Marta, very similar to the data that Marta was showing you earlier in her presentation, where we have accelerations measured along 3 axes. And here we have it over a 24-hour time interval from midnight to midnight. On the bottom panel, we have heart rate data. So we've actually processed that ECG data into 5-minute intervals of heart rate. So I think one thing that you can see, even if I hadn't highlighted it in orange, is that there's this very clear connection between the ECG and the accelerometer data, right? In this orange highlighted interval, you see sort of 2 phenomenon. The first is that sort of the amplitude along each axis is much lower than in the other periods. You also see that the relative ordering of the axes are much different than in other periods, right? In this interval, we have the ordering typically goes black, blue, red, and in the other periods, it typically goes red, maybe blue, and then black. What that actually tells us about the person's behavior, very simply, is that they're lying down and they're not moving too much. So what I focus my research on in a paper that I'm currently trying to publish is how to utilize this triaxial accelerometer data from this chest-mounted device to infer a person's posture at any given point in time while they're wearing the device. And that provides some helpful context when modeling or trying to study this ECG data, as we found in one paper. So I've been working with some cardiologists, specifically Wendy Post and Catherine Wu. And one thing that they were interested in was whether ventricular repolarization variability is associated with HIV infection. So if you look at this sort of cartoon of the ECG diagram, the period of ventricular polarization in the heartbeat occurs from the beginning of this Q wave to the end of the T wave. And researchers believe that that sort of the beat to beat variability in that segment of the heartbeat relative to sort of the variability in the overall length of the heartbeat, it might be predictive of rare arrhythmias and sudden cardiac death. So they want to see if it's higher in people living with HIV. However, one of the they were interested in, they weren't really interested in how sort of behavior might concurrently affect ventricular repolarization variability, right? So we know that ventricular repolarization variability is lower when people lay down, but we don't want to measure an association between HIV and ventricular repolarization variability just because people living with HIV lay down more. That's an important sort of mediating factor that we wanted to sort of net out in our analysis in order to study some other more interesting mediating factors like viral load, antiviral exposure, etc. So this is an example of how I used my indicator for posture from the Zio Xt Patch in order to control for those differences in behavioral factors. So just very quickly, the results that we learned, HIV was associated with higher variability in ventricular repolarization. And we think that it was really important to adjust for posture. It was one of the largest associations that we saw in our model. It was equivalent, the effect size of being upright versus recumbent was equivalent to about 25 years of age, maybe 4 times the size of the HIV sort of coefficient. However, at this point in time, it was really just sort of a hypothetical whether or not people living with HIV were recumbent much more often than people living without HIV. We hadn't actually directly studied whether there were differences in this activity and physical behavior of people living with HIV. So that was one of the next things that we studied. We found that men living with HIV were recumbent 22 minutes more per day, and they accumulated less activity during their wake periods in models adjusted for race, age, education, study center, and enrollment wave. So that I don't provide an estimate of sort of the association parameter between physical activity and or between accumulated physical activity and HIV because it's not very interpretable, but it was roughly equivalent to the effect that we would see associated with maybe 4.5 years of age. So men living with HIV in terms of their activity levels look approximately 4.5 years older compared to men not living with HIV. So I think there are even more opportunities to be explored here with these multimodal devices. And this is just a plot that sort of summarizes one such opportunity. I think that Ciprian has been really excited about and could be explored more. And that is sort of looking not at activity and heart rate and other ECG measures at sort of a macro day-to-day level, but at a very micro level. Sort of what we've done here for one individual is we've actually picked out periods during their 2-week wear time where they've gone from a very intense physical activity as denoted by these sort of highly variable red lines. That's acceleration measured in gravitational units to almost no physical activity. So we sort of see this red vertical line as sort of a change point in activity. And what we can do is we can look at sort of the beat to beat heart rate before and after that physical activity. We can look at how heart rate sort of recovers after that discrete change in physical activity. And we think that that if we could characterize that sort of recovery process, that might give us additional information about health. And certainly that's not just limited to heart rate. It could be, we could look at recovery of other ECG features as well. I think there's many more opportunities to be explored with these multimodal devices. Certainly this device only has 2 modes, activity and ECG, or cardiac activity. So I think that there's a lot more to explore here, and it's a very exciting field. That's really all I have for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lacey. Does anyone have, I've seen there's been a lot of activity in the chat with questions and answers. I saw from Marta. Does anyone have a question for Lacey or Marta? I'll probably take one question and then we'll have to move to the next group.
I'll quickly dive in. You know, Lacey, I'm thinking about the health of older adults in particular. You know, have you thought about anything that you could leverage the ECG data that you're collecting in the wild in large, you know, potentially large numbers of people to investigate?
It's hard. I don't know that much about how aging affects sort of these ECG processes or affects heart health. Certainly one thing that we saw with our sort of QTDI study was that ventricular repolarization variability was it increased with age. I imagine there could be links between age and sort of these recovery processes as well. But I think before, well, maybe not before, but I think there is perhaps a lack of, actually, I don't know if I want to say a lack. So the data collected in the MAX study was just collected at one time point. I would really like to see this kind of data collected longitudinally to sort of be able to better assess whether these processes would change with age. But if you have any ideas of, you know, projects or sort of ECG markers that could be, you know, investigated and their associations with age, I would love to hear about it. I think really here the connection with age is just looking at sort of the comorbidity load and how these things are associated with different accumulation of different comorbidities.
In 10 seconds, I'll just say that we hypothesize that autonomic nervous system functioning is, you know, it's one of the key systems that is implicated in frailty. And so investigating, you know, changes leading to frailty could shed etiological light, you know, so that would be very exciting.
Okay. So what we find, basically, there are 3 big predictors of mortality: age, physical activity measured objectively, and heart rates and heart measures. These are the biggest things. We see them over and over again. They are, and physical activity and QT actually are even better predictor than age of mortality. So this is what I see over and over and over again.
Thank you so much to Marta and Lacey. We're going to move next to the Engage lab. Jennifer, would you like to say anything briefly to start, or Jennifer Yasik, please?
Sure, I have like a 1-minute intro here that I'd like to show people. So hopefully everybody can see my screen now. So just really quick, I wanted to introduce you to our group, Engage, what the name stands for. It stands for Energy, Physical Activity, and Gerontology, or you could say Energy, Physical Activity, and Aging, either works. We have a really large, diverse group of faculty, staff, fellows, and students with interests and backgrounds in biostats, epi, mental health, and engineering. So I'm really proud of the fact that we've been able to kind of bridge so many fields. Let's see here. We're best known for our work with BLSA, but we have a lot of other projects we're working on that are shown here. Many of these are still in data collection mode, but we've implemented risk accelerometry data collection and management protocols in all of these studies. So there's going to be a lot of new and exciting work coming up, and we're going to give you a taste of that today. So Fangyu, Yurun, Venus, and Francesca are going to give you quick 5-minute presentations to kind of showcase their projects and give you an idea of the range of work we're doing. So now I'm going to turn it over to the people that really matter and start with Fangyu. We'll stop.
Can everyone see the slides? Okay. Thank you, Jennifer, for that introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Fangyu. I'm currently a research assistant in the Department of Epi. So in the next 5 minutes, I will present you briefly the results from our study on the epidemiology of physical activity measured by risk accelerometers in the Baltimore Longitudinal Study of Aging, or the BLSA. So in 2014, Jen collaborated with Vadim and Chiu, and they published this paper describing the difference in the daily patterns of physical activity using the chest-wound accelerometer data in BLSA. This is the full title of the paper that Marta just cited. Later on in the 2015, the BLSA actually switched from the chest-worn devices to wrist-worn devices. So our current study updates this 2014 paper and expands it from it by categorizing physical activity measured by the newer devices. So very briefly, we examine the cross-sectional and the longitudinal associations between various participant characteristics and several physical activity metrics. In this presentation, I will only focus on 2 characteristics, age and usual gait speed, and 3 of the physical activity metrics that are highlighted here. So the 24-hour diurnal pattern and the total daily physical activity were examined in the 2014 paper. The third matrix, activity fragmentation, was measured by active to sedentary transition probability, or ASTP. This metric was developed by Vadim and Junrui from the SMART group, which is another fruit from our cross-group collaboration. Next, I will show you some of the results from the cross-sectional analyses. First is the unadjusted plot of the minute level physical activity across 24 hours by age. So we can see that the physical activity during waking time decreases with older age. The decrease is more evident in the afternoon than in the morning. For participants who are at or above 65 years, they no longer have the peak of activity in the afternoon, which is more evident in the other 3 younger age groups. As a comparison, I have the same plot from the 2014 paper on the right. You have seen this plot just now a few minutes back. So despite the differences in the grouping of the age, we see a very similar decline of activity in the afternoon as people, like comparing older people to younger people. For the other 2 physical activity metrics that are not highly dimensional as the 24-hour diurnal pattern, we fit linear regression models for each of them, including the participant characteristics as the independent variables. For age and gait speed, we notice some potential nonlinear relationship from data exploration as shown in these plots. So based on this observation and some published, previously published literature, we included linear spline knots at age 65 and gait speed at 1 meter per second to test whether there's indeed some nonlinear association. The spline terms were not significant for the total daily physical activity models and were hence removed from the final model. So across all ages, total daily physical activity is about 12,000 counts lower for every one year greater age. And across all gait speeds, total daily physical activity is 20,500 counts lower for every 0.05 meter per second slower gait. However, the spline terms were significant in the activity fragmentation models. Greater age is only associated with more fragmented physical activity among the participants who are at or above 65 years old. And faster gait speed is only associated with less fragmented physical activity for the participants who already have a clinically slowed gait, which is less than 1 meter per second. Next, I will briefly show the longitudinal results. We fit linear mixed effects model, including the main terms of baseline age, time since baseline, and the interaction of the two. The model also adjusted for the other participant characteristics we look at in the cross-sectional analyses. As indicated by the coefficient of the interaction terms, we see that the annual rate of decline in the total daily physical activity and the annual rate of increase in the activity fragmentation accelerated with higher age. Based on the prediction from this mixed effects model, we find that annual deterioration actually becomes significant at age 76 and 79, respectively, for the total physical activity and fragmentation. This result suggests that the total daily physical activity actually declines before the activity fragmentation changes. So that's all I have for this presentation. I will now pass on to Yurun, who will talk about studies from the study.
Sure, I'm gonna share my screen. Can everyone see my slides? Okay. So hello everyone, my name is Yurun. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Department of Epidemiology. Today I'm gonna share some research work we did in study. And the study is a study to understand fall reduction in vitamin D in youth. And for my presentation, I'm gonna talk about the effects of daily vitamin D supplementation on objectively measured physical activity. Study was designed to understand the association between vitamin D and falls. However, it is very important to note that this association may be confounded or modified by physical activity. Older adults who are less active may fall less, but mainly because they have fewer opportunities to fall. And previous studies have found that vitamin D deficiency impacts bone health and is associated with poor muscle strength and also reduced physical performance. There is also cross-sectional evidence suggesting that older adults with vitamin D deficiency had lower physical activity levels. However, in addition to limited ability to assess temporality in these cross-sectional studies, these studies mainly focused on self-reported physical activity data. In addition, whether vitamin D supplementation attenuates physical activity decline has remained unknown. So in this study, we aim to explore the longitudinal association between vitamin D supplementation and objectively measured physical activity in older people with low serum vitamin D levels, which means 10 to 29 nanogram per milliliter. Participants were randomized to either a higher dose or 200 IU per day of vitamin D3. We compared the pooled higher doses to the 200 IU dose. The outcome were 3 measures, the total daily activity count per day, and also number of active minutes per day, and activity fragmentation. The first 2 are measures of activity volume, and the third measure, activity fragmentation, as Fangyu has already mentioned in her presentation, this is a way to quantify patterns of activity by looking at the transitions from an active state to a sedentary state. And previous studies have already found that higher fragmentation is associated with poor physical functioning and greater risk of mortality. And in this study, we hypothesized that physical activity would decline less over time in the higher dose groups compared to the lower dose group. We measured physical activity in study using the active graph link accelerometer. Here are the baseline statistics. The average activity volume was about 1.9 million counts per day, and the average amount of time spent active was 384 minutes, which is around 6.5 hours per day. And activity fragmentation averaged 26%. After the baseline visit, participants were followed up at 3 months and 12 months and up to 24 months follow-up. For this analysis, we used the linear mixed effects models for 3 physical activity measures in separate models. We found that physical activity declined over time, and those who were more active at baseline remained more active over follow-up. As you can see from the figure on the right side, those who had vitamin D deficiency, which is the blue line, declined faster in total daily activity compared to those people who had low serum vitamin D level but not deficient yet in the red line in this figure. However, there's no significant treatment effect on physical activity comparing the pooled higher dose in the left in the panel and compared to the control dose, which is 200 IU per day on the right side of the panel. You can see the trajectory of physical activity decline is pretty similar. In summary, we found that daily physical activity declined over time, regardless of vitamin D supplementation. And those who were vitamin D deficient at baseline declined more over time than those with low serum vitamin D. And participants who were more active at baseline remained more active over time. And this also emphasizes the importance of maintaining physical activity later in life. And as the main finding in this study is that older adults with vitamin D deficiency tended to decline faster over time, future longitudinal studies are needed to assess physical activity by changes of serum vitamin D levels. And that's all for my presentation today. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Yurun. I believe that Venus is presenting next.
Yes. But can you stop sharing so I can share, Yurun?
Sure.
Thank you. Okay, can everybody see the presentation view? Yeah, okay, perfect. All right, so my name is Venus. I'm a first-year master's student here in the Department of Epidemiology, and I will start by picking up from where Yurun left off and talk about another study that we're doing with sturdy data. So this one in particular, it's in collaboration with the Pepper Center, and it's about how daily physical activity measured by accelerometry worn at the wrist is longitudinally associated with incidence frailty in older adults. So we looked at 470 older participants with an average age of around 76 years old over the span of 2 years. And within the 2 years, there were 46 incidents of frailty. So if you look to the graph on the right here, we adjusted for everything, including treatment assignment and sturdy, and also inflammation biomarkers in model 3. And what we found was the higher the volume of activity, so we're talking about more time spent active, less time spent sedentary, and more total activity counts a day. So the higher the volume of physical activity, the lower the hazard of incidence frailty. And we also found that the higher the activity fragmentation, So as the previous presenters have talked about, this is looking at how often someone transitions from an active to an inactive state. So the more fragmented the activity of the older participants in the study, the higher the hazard of incidence frailty. So what the results tell us is that if we can monitor daily physical activity using accelerometry, it might help us predict frailty in older adults. And if we can think of ways to better intervene on the abnormal volume or patterns of physical activity in older adults, we may be able to prevent frailty in them in the future as well. So up until this point, we've been talking about Sturdy. I'm now going to completely switch gear and talk about a different study. And this is the Hispanic Community Health Study, or the Study of Latinos, and we call it SOUL. So the goal of SOUL is to understand disease and health conditions affecting the Latino population in the United States. From 2008 to 2011, they recruited over 16,000 participants. And these are people that are 18 to 74 years of age. They are of Latino or Hispanic background, and they are either or both English and Spanish speaking. And what's really unique about this study I want to highlight is the fact that it's the largest epidemiology study of Latino population in the United States. And out of the 16,000 participants they were able to enroll at baseline, they were able to get close to 15,000 of them to wear a hip accelerometer at baseline, which is quite impressive. So this is where our team is involved. This is an ancillary study that's embedded in SOUL. It's called the Peripheral Artery Disease Study of SOUL, or PASOS. So the goal of PASOS is to understand the impact of peripheral artery disease on daily free living physical activity using accelerometry. So this study right now, it's still in the recruitment phase. We are and will be recruiting around 6,000 SOUL participants who are 45 years of age or older. And our team will basically be adding another round of accelerometry data using the wrist-worn accelerometer on the slide here. And we are overseeing the data collection, the data analytics of accelerometry in this study. So while we collect data for PASOS, we thought we would start exploring some research questions about peripheral artery disease using accelerometry data that's already available in SOUL and will eventually be available in PASOS as well. So one way you can diagnose peripheral artery disease is through using the ankle brachial index, or ABI. And the index is the ratio of blood pressure at the ankle to the arm. So the lower the index, the higher the arterial blockage. Anything below a 0.9, that's considered diagnostic of peripheral artery disease. So from research, we know that individuals with lower ABI, they sometimes experience leg symptoms. A lot of the times that's leg pain. So we hypothesize that to avoid pain, people may walk less, or maybe they will rest more when they're walking, which will affect their daily physical activity. So to find out if that's the case, we want to ask a couple questions. One being, what's the cross-sectional and longitudinal association between ABI and daily physical activity? And the second one is, which activity metrics, so is it activity volume or is it activity pattern, that are more strongly associated with ABI? And these questions, they will help us understand whether physical activity metrics are sensitive to progression to peripheral artery disease in the Hispanic community living population. So that's it for me. I'm going to pass it on to Francesca to talk about her research.
All right, can you all see the correct orientation? Okay, I can't see you, so I'm going to assume that's a yes. So my name is Francesca. I'm a first-year epidemiology doctoral student, and today I'll be presenting on the ongoing pilot study that's called WATCHES. The formal title is Free Living Physical Activity Patterns in Black or African Americans with and Without Memory Problems. So for a brief background, Alzheimer's is the most common type of dementia, and evidence suggests older African American individuals are disproportionately affected. Much of the prior research on mechanisms, diagnosis, and treatment has been done in populations of older non-Hispanic white individuals. And it is important to study MCI in dementia in underserved communities since health disparities can exert a variety of negative effects, such as delayed diagnosis or inadequate treatment. One potential way to reach these populations is to use technologies such as accelerometers to capture day-to-day movement-based behaviors. Evidence suggests differences in physical activity patterns and movement can potentially be used as markers to detect early and intervenable trajectories of Alzheimer's. More and more people, including individuals from underserved populations, are purchasing consumer-grade devices such as the Apple Watch. Utilizing this technology provides a potential mechanism to recruit and study MCI and dementia in these populations by studying their physical activity patterns. So with that background in mind, the first aim is to compare differences in objective physical activity patterns between individuals with MCI or mild dementia and normal cognition. And we hypothesize those with abnormal cognition will have lower total daily physical activity, higher bouts of activity, and delayed and diminished diurnal patterns. The second aim is to validate accelerometer data from the Apple Watch with the research-grade ActiGraph, which are shown on the right of the slide. And we hypothesize the data from these two watches will be highly correlated. And the third aim is to explore the feasibility of deploying both wearables to measure patterns of continuous physical activity data in this population. So participants for the study are referred from the Johns Hopkins Alzheimer's Disease Research Center, which follows a cohort of older adults with normal cognition, MCI, or dementia. And from the ADRC, we are provided with demographic information as well as detailed cognitive data. After receiving the recruitment list, a research assistant calls and consents interested participants. Participants are then mailed the two watches, charger, study questionnaires, and bedtime log as shown on the right. And after participants receive the package, we meet with them over Zoom to review the study procedures. Participants are asked to wear both watches and complete the bedtime log for 10 consecutive days and then mail everything back to us. And after we receive and process the data, we send participants a feedback form that looks like this picture with their individual physical activity data that's collected during the study. The primary data collection comes from the Apple Watch and ActiGraph. Participants are asked to wear both watches at the same time on their non-dominant wrist for 10 days as demonstrated by the top image. We also ask participants to fill out a log with the times they went to bed and woke up, as well as any other times they removed the watches, so physical activity can be separated from sleep and non-wear. From the data collected by the watches, we calculate total activity counts, activity bouts, and other metrics, which will be used to determine whether there are differences in physical activity patterns between the two groups. Since the Apple Watch is not intended for research-grade data collection, there have been some challenges with this data. First, participants must turn on data collection every day using an app called SensorLog, as shown by the middle image. And second, the Apple Watch battery typically does not last a full day, so participants must remove the Apple Watch to charge it overnight. And this is demonstrated by the bottom image. And third, each individual log file must be downloaded separately and then combined, which can be a time-intensive process. And we've adapted to these problems with the help from Michelle Carlson's Brain Health Study Lab and our great research assistants, Nikki and Fangyu, who you heard from earlier. Specifically, we have improved the study materials we send to participants, and we make sure participants practice how they will wear, charge, and turn on data collection for the watches during the Zoom study visits. And in fact, the images shown in this slide are taken directly out of our manual of procedures, which is provided to participants and used as training for staff. We will have rich physical activity and cognition data available from this study, and we hope this information can be informative for future projects and analyses. And some questions we hope to address include determining whether these physical activity differences are clinically meaningful, whether they're intervenable, and whether we can utilize Apple Watches for data collection to reach more underserved populations. And that is all I have for today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Francesca, and thank you, all of the presenters. It was terrific. Does anyone have, we probably have time for maybe one very quick question or a closing remark from Jennifer, or if anyone would like to add anything? Okay, well, in the interest of time, I think we'll go ahead and we'll turn to our final group, last but not least, the Brain Health Study Lab. Michelle, would you like to say anything?
Sure, I'll go ahead and introduce our two groups of presenters. It is, and I think the order I'm not clear on if it's first Kyle and Brianna, perhaps? Okay, great. Thanks, Brianna gave me the thumbs up. So it's a pleasure to kind of, especially to hear these amazing presentations. And then we're going to, I'm going to be introducing Kyle and Brianna. Kyle, of course, our wonderful alum among many here. And they're going to be sharing some work that they've been doing with Andy Rosso's PRIMA study data, very exciting preliminary results from that. And then from there, we'll share a little update on the bandit intervention that many of you have seen or heard about. We can't wait for you to come to one of our two labs to come play it and beat bandit or help bandit eat and do well. So with that, I'm going to be introducing Dr. Dana Eldreth, a former postdoctoral fellow here at Hopkins in MRI, who's now working with me as a research faculty, and Alyssa Kaiser, who is my research assistant, and together really doing some great work in helping to develop bandit and get bandit ready for a TBI, a traumatic brain injury intervention that we're doing with Matt Peters over in the on the Bayview campus. And I'll turn it over to Brianna.
Thank you, Michelle. All right, let's share my screen. All right, can I get a thumbs up from someone that they can see my screen? Awesome, thank you, Michelle. All right, well, that was a great introduction from Michelle, but I'm Brianna. I'm a second year PhD student here in the Department of Mental Health. Kyle, did you want to introduce yourself, or for the sake of time, just move forward?
Sure, I'll just briefly say, hi, I'm Kyle. It's nice to see everybody again. Currently a postdoc at Pittsburgh, but formerly one of Michelle's students and one of the EBA fellows.
Awesome. So we're going to be presenting some data from the PRIMA study with Andrea Rosso's group on exploring community mobility characteristics in older adults using GPS technologies. So community mobility is defined as an individual's movement outside of the home. As you can see from the plot on the bottom, research on community mobility has increased exponentially since the early 2000s, with over 1,100 articles published last year on community mobility. Community mobility is essential for the completion of many instrumental activities of daily living, including laundry, grocery shopping, but it also aids in the promotion of physical function, social engagement, and independent living and quality of life. Recent studies have suggested that restricted community mobility might be an indicator of increased dementia risk, but despite the clear importance of community mobility to the health and well-being of older adults, it's often rarely considered in research interventions. Typical ways of capturing community mobility previously was through retrospective self-report, where you ask participants how often they left their home, their bedroom, their neighborhood, etc., in the past X number of days. However, this can be subject to recall bias, or you could ask participants to complete travel diaries, which might be burdensome to the participant as they require the date, the time, the reason for departure, the number of miles traveled, etc. So recently, we have the opportunity to capture objective measures of community mobility using GPS. And this is just an example of one characteristic of community mobility. So we can see in the image in the middle, this participant has a rather limited life space or community mobility characteristics. They only made one trip throughout the duration of the study, compared to the participant on the right, who made a much higher frequency of trips with varying durations of stay at each location. So the study goal here was to use GPS technologies to obtain objective measures of community mobility characteristics in older adults. As Michelle mentioned earlier, we're grateful to have Andrea Rosso and the collaborators at Pittsburgh on board who provided the data for PRIMA. PRIMA stands for Program to Improve Mobility in Aging, and we're using the GPS data that's collected at all time points, which is baseline, post, 24 and 36 weeks. Participants were asked to carry the device for 7 days and complete a written log of when they turned on the device, when they took it off, and any period in between where they had to remove it for bathing or showering. It is important to note that We had to use 2 devices. So the iBlue was used earlier in the study. The V990 was used later due to some technical malfunctions associated with the iBlue. But both devices had a battery saver mode when participants were not moving. The current GPS metrics that we're using are centered around activity space and shape, as well as activity duration and timing. So very briefly, just want to orient you towards the left side of the screen. There are many different ways to capture one's activity space. You can use the minimum convex polygon shown on the right, which is a polygon that encapsulates the outermost points traveled by the participant. However, you can see that there are a lot of location points here that the participant actually never really went to. So it can often overestimate the life space. So we use the standard deviation ellipse as well, which is a more conservative measure that encapsulates approximately 2/3 of the geographic points of the participant. And so what we're looking at is the area on the perimeter of this person's life space, as well as the compactness, which basically tells you how elongated their life space is. If it's closer to a line, the compactness is 0. If it's closer to a circle, the compactness is 1. And then we're also looking at other metrics such as activity duration or timing, which include the maximum distance traveled from home, as well as the date and time that you reach that maximum distance, and the percentage of time spent outside of a home buffer. We added a buffer to account for the noise and jitter that often accompanies GPS data. So the measures were generated for each day on the 7-day wear, and we summarized them using 7-day medians to account for extreme outliers that might be associated with taking the mean. And so I'll turn it over to Kyle to complete the presentation.
All right, thank you so much, Brianna. And I was gonna go over some challenges we've had with the GPS data, and I'm so glad we're able to present it to this group because I think a lot of these challenges sort of overlap with accelerometry, but I think GPS has some, I think, unique challenges as well. So we're of course open to any feedback you all might have. But the first challenge is of course measurement error. So this could be due to urban canopy, device initialization, like when the device turns on, it takes a while to sort of triangulate your location, the device dying mid-transit. And just as an example of this, I have to the right here, this is the exact same trip Brianna showed in the last slide. This is from my test data walking around Pittsburgh. And you can see in this trip, for whatever reason, the second device I was carrying picked up all these sort of extraneous points. So this has been complicated, and I think it's further complicated by the device's sort of battery saving mode, where sometimes when we see these big jumps in time, we don't always know if that's because of measurement error, or if that's because of somebody isn't moving. So, you know, our solution right now, since some of the measures we've been deriving are time weighted, we've tried to be especially conscious about removing really huge time and distance gaps where the participants really unaccounted for, and that these points are influential in these measures. So in an effort to be more conservative. The second issue is unreliable use. So we do have some participants that wear the device only some of the days of the week. So we do currently exclude people who wore less than 5 days of recorded data, just because we do want a reliable estimate of their weekly activity. And this isn't a huge proportion of participants, fortunately. And then finally, participants also have some unusual travel patterns. So we have participants going out of the state, and participants, one participant went to Germany during the study. So we have these days where there's extreme amounts of travel. So this kind of gets to Brianna's point earlier, that we use median weekly measures to try to account for these days of extreme activity and trying to get at their typical activity for the week. And then, yeah, so then these are some participant characteristics for the PRIMA sample. Just very briefly, the average age was about 77. Most participants were pretty highly educated. And fortunately, since this is just the baseline data, most of this data comes from just one device, just the iBlue device. 96% of participants use that device. And we have a nice distribution across seasons as well, which is nice as well. And I won't go through each of these activity measures individually, but as you can see from kind of going from the mean to the median, they are pretty skewed, even using the median measures. And just to give you a little bit of context, so that maximum value for standard deviation ellipse and median, it's about 1,200 square kilometers, which is about half of the total area of Allegheny County, which I have highlighted here, which is where the participants were sampled from. So these particular people, there weren't a lot of them, but these people would be leaving the county several times a week, mostly by driving. So yeah, I figured that's a good snapshot of what the data looks like. And then here are just some very preliminary results for one of our GPS measures, percentage of time outside of the home buffer. And what you can see is I report Spearman correlations here, and you can see that more time spent outside of the home was associated with higher 6-minute walking test performance, faster performance in the trail making test part B. So it's a measure of executive functioning. And then also correlated with higher scores on the life space assessment. This is a self-rated measure of somebody's life space mobility. And these were significant after age and sex adjustment as well, although something that sort of struck me, and I think struck a lot of us looking at this, was how small the correlations were. And I think it kind of lends to the fact that, function is only one piece of contributing to somebody's mobility in these GPS measures. There's a lot that are probably explaining the variance in these measures. And I think that's, yes. And then just briefly, some future directions we are interested in going with this work, including looking at different metrics, including within day and across day variability, number of trips outside the home, things like that. Looking at differences by neighborhood characteristics. So bringing in neighborhood walkability measures, as well as socioeconomic status. And then also looking at differences by active versus passive travel, so walking versus driving. Fortunately, these devices do capture the speed with which one's moving. So we're hoping we can sort of figure out how to use that to separate driving time or passive time from time where they're actually walking, which could be meaningfully different. And I think we just wanted to acknowledge, of course, our mentors and the collaborators on the project, including Dr. Carlson and Dr. Rosso, and of course, Dr. Rosso for her access to the data, the GPS ancillary data, and then our funding sources. But that's, I think, all we have. So thank you, guys.
Thanks so much, Brianna and Kyle. It was terrific. For our last speakers, we have Dana Eldreth and Alyssa Kaiser. So I'll turn it over to you.
Can you guys see my slide? Okay. Yeah, so today we're going to be discussing Bandit the dolphin. And since Michelle's been such an integral part of that, we decided to kind of let her lead and discuss a little bit more of her studies, and then I'll jump in a little bit more. Okay.
No, go ahead, you take it away. The only thing I would add here is that we would add in collaboration with the Kata Lab. This is a new slide, and I would just want to make sure we recognize John Krakauer's engineering team. They're just really doing some elegant work, so it's a collaboration with them.
Okay. Great. So one of the studies that Michelle started out with was the SWIM study. That was a pilot study to assess the reception, feasibility, and short-term impact of Bandit the dolphin, which is a 3D immersive cognitive motor digital technology that we'll be talking about. And it's really been interesting. It's actually really fun to play as well. And the outcomes that we looked at were cognition, functional health, and then this is in aging adults within a senior living community. And then so the digital technology, like Michelle mentioned, it's a collaboration between the Kata team and the Brain Learning, Animation, and Movement Lab at Johns Hopkins. It initially was used for post-stroke rehabilitation. And during the SWIM study and for 1.0 and then ultimately 2.0, the Carlson Lab has adapted it for cognitive and physical training using the Microsoft's Kinect system, which is a motion capture platform to watch somebody actually capture the arm movements to control Bandit. So what this requires is a complex combination of skilled arm movements that captures like varying levels of cognitive challenges, such as eating fish and sharks that are swimming and moving swiftly. And I think when you see the video, I'll kind of go through a little bit more so you can kind of see exactly what I'm talking about here. And the difficulty for 1.0 was adapted, across the 15 visits that they did. And now with 2.0, the CATA team has kind of integrated the feedback that we've given them to really make it more of a cognitive component. And now it goes over a series, I think, of like 398 levels. So there's definitely a lot of time where they get trained early on to learn fish behaviors, learn how to manipulate bandit, and really just develop the skill set to perform it really well. So I've played it plenty of time and it's really fun. So I think it's something that people can kind of maintain, as opposed to maybe a physical activity regimen. And here in this Venn diagram here, you can see how bandit actually captures the physical activity component. And again, you'll see that in the video as you watch people move as they're playing it. And then it also gets at the cognitive training to actually be able to capture fish efficiently as well. Okay, so here's Pat. He was kind enough to to let us capture a video of him playing. And he's doing the unilateral level. So there are several levels with this that really make it more complex, in terms of cognitive components. So his level, you'll see he's just manipulating it with one hand. And he doesn't have the boost or bolt, which can make bandit move faster or make bandit whip his tail and stun the fish to make them a little bit easier to capture. So let me just show you this here. This was working earlier. Yeah, sorry. I hate to do this, but Alyssa, is there any way you can pull this up on your screen? This was running just recently here. Oh, here we go. Okay. Yeah, so you can see him right here manipulating bandit with his right arm. And you can see that because it's a unilateral level, it really requires a lot of, ability to control your arm movements. And one thing you would also notice is the behavior of the fish. They're really more elusive. So they're a little bit more difficult to capture here. And that's how you'll see the next video will show you that the fish behaviors are slightly different, so it really requires a slightly different skill set. And like I said, over the course of playing, it really kind of gets your level of training and your ability to identify fish behaviors really at a good level to perform. Later on, it actually gets a lot harder.
Is Dana, I think, Dana, are you trying to pull up Alyssa's video?
Yeah, do you have that, Alyssa, here? Okay, wait.
And Pat's moving in slow motion. If you know Pat, that's the way he moves. I'm kidding. He's actually super good at this game, super good. He embarrassed me. I didn't want to follow him in playing. He's so good.
I'd say that's an exaggeration, but I've only played it a few times.
Hey, Dana, it might help if you take it out of presentation mode.
Okay. Okay, here we go. So here you can see the fish. They move a bit quicker. And these fish are kind of mean, so they can actually bite Bandit and actually take away his lives. So the goal of this is to try not to get bit and try to actually catch the fish. So you'll see a little clicker in Alyssa's left hand, and there she can control Bandit's movement by making him go faster or actually whip his tail to stun the fish. So they're a little bit easier to catch. So, and she has some really broad movements, you know, so that's kind of interesting to see that kind of difference there. And obviously she's very good at this now because she's played it a lot as well. Okay. And then
is humbling, by the way. So I'm going to say that while you're I see you got it up, but Alyssa, and maybe when we're done here, Alyssa might comment as well on her thoughts on playing it. But I think it's wonderful to watch them develop their skills using the clicker. So I think that's something you can't see as easily in the video, but it's really important. It's very cognitively challenging.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and you can tell that you're learning over the course of the game, you know, so a lot of times once you capture a skill, it's a bit rewarding as well. So yeah, so obviously a big interest is activity monitoring in this whole group here. And then the course of the swim study design, we looked at older adults who were living in a senior living center. And during the pre-intervention assessment, we got at cognitive performance as well as physical function. So we used some executive function, memory, processing speed tasks, as well as assessments for dementia. And then after that assessment, we had them do 1 week of wearing activity monitoring devices to capture community mobility, life space, and all that stuff. And as you can see here, one of the devices that was used was the Apple Watch. And as other people alluded to, you know, it's kind of has its own issues with battery life. So that's definitely been something that we've been troubleshooting as well. And then they were also asked to wear the piezo just to get step count as well. And then following the mobility, we did the 5 weeks of intervention. So it was the intervention occurring 3 times a week for 60 minutes. So it was pretty intense for participants, but they really enjoyed playing it. And I believe in some of the focus groups, some of the participants said it was sneaky exercise. So, so it was really kind of good to see that aspect as well. So after doing that intervention, again, we did the assessments for community and life-based mobility. And then that's when we had them do the tracking with the Apple Watch, as well as the piezo logger. And then after that, participants, again, took the assessments of cognitive performance and then as well as physical function. And again, that was, you know, executive function, processing speed, memory, the same tasks. And I forgot to mention the physical function was grip strength and the SPPB. And then some of the metrics that we collected for this particular study was the levels completed over the course of the 15 sessions. So here you can see on the x-axis, it's the 15 sessions that participants participated in. And these were the levels completed here on the Y. And each of these lines represent one specific participant. It's important to know that over the course of this of the gameplay, it goes up to 110 levels and it progressively gets more difficult for participants. So here you can kind of see that many of the participants, you know, by the time they got to the end of the trial, they were getting close to the 110 levels. But kind of interesting is that some of these folks were really doing an awesome job. So they got past the 110 levels, at which point they were asked to perform the game using their non-dominant hand. And they still did a great job improving over the course of the 15th session. So it's really interesting to see that kind of improvement over time, as well as we're looking at the time to complete task and several other metrics in 2.0. And as always, it's always great to acknowledge everybody in the lab. So Michelle Carlson, Brianna, Kyle, Brittany, myself, or some of the people that have been playing it more recently, and Alyssa, I don't think you're on here, so I apologize for that. And then also members of the BLAM lab, so John, Krakauer, Omar, Ahmed, and then Pramit Roy. And then also, you know, Andy and Katerina we're players in it as well. So, and then I guess, Alyssa, do you want to make any comments on some of your experience? I know 2.0, you've probably been the person most involved in it, and you've done a great job doing the scripts and teaching people as well. I know Pat has been really enjoying working with you too, so.
Yeah. Not much more to add. The only thing I'd say is it's really cool to see how the game development has changed from Bandit 1.0 to 2.0, to really see how the behaviors of the sharks and fish have changed to become a little more intelligent and challenging. So it's just a really exciting time.
Yeah, and now with the 2.0, we're getting ready to get Michelle's DoD study off the ground. So that'll be an exciting next journey of this game. So it'll be in a group of TBI patients as well. So, and that's all I have for now.
Everyone, thank you so very much. And we should do the same thing as for others. Is there a quick question for either of our speaker groups?
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
To Michelle's group. So you're using video game to improve patients' mobility. Now, there are some anecdotal evidence that video games can also improve memory and overall mental health. So are you interested in looking into that, or are you aware of any research done in this area?
Yeah, do you want me to take that, or Dana, or someone else? Did someone want to take that, or?
Yeah, you're more than welcome to take it if you want.
Okay, so yeah, there is a group, Adam Gazzelli at UCSF has probably been leading the charge, and he's got a two-dimensional game that's been demonstrating some cognitive benefits, and somebody, Craig Stark as well in California. So there's been a West Coast contingent that's really been embracing video gaming. Probably the East Coast, for whatever reason, we're a little bit more measured in our pace. So I'm hoping we're going to kind of amp up the game by going 3D. And the reason we're going 3D is because we want to try to mimic, we're trying to train to the real world. And the real world typically doesn't involve just cognition or just mobility. It involves the integration of the two. I always like to say that the brain travels with the body. And so we should design interventions that recognize that. So my goal is to see that the outcomes that we use in the intermediate, they're mobility outcomes, activity outcomes. And I would love to engage as we start collecting data. I would love to engage people here. We can't do this alone. It's very hard work on the GPS in particular, but in collecting the data as well as looking at it. But and Brianne and Kyle are doing amazing work. But with regard to what we're trying to see, our goal is really this idea that we're training both cognition and physical function without directly training it. We're training to this three-dimensional complex spatial navigation task.
So you see, Michelle, I think we identified a niche of video gaming research at East Coast. I'm a big video game fan, so count me in.
Oh, please.
If you guys interested.
Oh, we're so much so. I think COVID has really knocked us on our side for a little while, and we are now upright and moving. And again, thank you to Dana and Alyssa for all that they're doing on Bandit 2.0. It is absolutely a different game. And the sharks and the fish now travel in pairs. They gang up. They do things that 1.0 didn't do. So there's there's a lot of social nuance in this game as well. But I would really appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and if people want to play, yeah, I'm happy to have people come to the lab, like Michelle said, and play. It's really getting that kind of experience really gives you an appreciation for the game. And like I said, it's really fun to play as well. So.
Yeah, I played the previous version, so yeah, I'm very interested in a sequel.
Mm-hmm.
Thank
you.
Everyone,
if you can turn your cameras on, I actually have everybody on one screen now, so we can quickly take a photo for anybody who's willing. Why don't we do a couple? I'll count. All right, so photo number 1, we're going to count 3, 2, 1, smile. Sorry. Got it? Okay, and photo number 2, 3, 2, 1. Do whatever you want. And I got that one too. So great. We'll circulate them once I've been able to crop and that sort of thing. So everyone, thank you so much. You know, this is such an exciting session for us, a speed session rather than our usual featuring one at a time. We learned so much, and each of these labs is doing such impressive things, and the way that you collaborate and cross with each other too is even more synergistic. So why don't we give them, you know, one more round of applause. Thank you guys, all of you.
So Karen, some collaborators reached out to me for the recording. They couldn't be here in person. Are we able to share the recording with the close collaborators or not?
Yes, we can.
All right, awesome. Great,
Yeah,
thank you.
I'll send the link around to everyone. You're welcome to share it.
Excellent.
All right, well, we'll see you next time. To many of you, to the others, thank you so much for visiting, and please have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.